On the morning of April 8, 1994, a quiet electrician arrived at a greenhouse above Lake Washington in Seattle. It was supposed to be routine maintenance. Instead, through a pane of glass, he saw a figure lying motionless inside the house. At first glance, it looked like someone asleep. The television was on. The room was still. But something felt wrong. Police were called. Within hours, the name began circulating through newsrooms, radio stations, and television screens across America. KURT Cobain had been found dead at 27. The speed of the announcement stunned the world. MTV interrupted regular programming. Radio hosts struggled to steady their voices. Outside the Seattle Center, fans gathered in disbelief, some crying openly, others silent, staring at the ground as if something irreversible had shifted beneath them. This was not just the death of a rock singer. It felt like the collapse of a mood, an era, a voice that had articulated confusion and rage for millions. The 1990s were still young, grunge was still loud, and yet the sound that defined it had suddenly gone quiet. What made the shock heavier was the proximity. Seattle was not Hollywood. It wasn't distant or mythic. It was rain-soaked streets, small venues, record stores. KURT Cobain had seemed tangible, flawed, outspoken, anti-polished. He wasn't built like a distant superstar. He was built like someone who might still be reachable. But now the house overlooking the water had become a fixed point in music history. Reporters debated timelines. Police confirmed details. Rumors ignited almost instantly. In the hours after the news broke, something else began to circulate. His lyrics. Lines from "Come As You Are." Fragments from "All Apologies." Fans replayed them, searching for meaning that might have been hidden in plain sight. Had the warning been there all along, or had they only learned how to read it after the silence? Before the investigations, before the speculation, before the mythology hardened, there was simply that moment, a house on a hill, a still body, and a generation trying to understand how its reluctant spokesman had disappeared. Long before the house on Lake Washington became a landmark of tragedy, there was Aberdeen, Washington, a damp timber town wrapped in gray skies and routine expectation. This was where KURT Cobain spent his childhood, far from stadiums and spotlights. Aberdeen was not built for dreamers. It was built for labor. Logging, fishing, blue-collar stability, the kind of place where deviation feels visible. As a child, KURT was described as energetic, artistic, unusually sensitive. He drew constantly. He fixated on details. He seemed both curious and withdrawn, as if observing the world from a slight distance. When his parents divorced, that distance widened. The split fractured more than a household. It fractured his sense of belonging. Moving between homes, feeling displaced, KURT began to retreat inward. Friends from school would later recall a boy who oscillated between humor and isolation. He admired punk rock not just for its sound, but for its refusal to conform. Punk offered vocabulary for alienation. It didn't demand polish. It didn't apologize for anger. In Aberdeen, that attitude clashed with expectation. Authority figures saw rebellion. KURT saw honesty. Teenage years intensified the disconnect. He experimented with identity. Different friends, different scenes, different attempts at finding alignment. School felt restrictive. He drifted academically, gravitating instead toward music and art. His room became a laboratory of noise, cheap guitars, distorted amplifiers, scribbled lyrics. Music wasn't yet ambition. It was escape. In interviews years later, he would speak of feeling like an outsider in his own town, too strange for the mainstream, too introspective for simple rebellion. Eventually, conflict at home escalated. KURT left before finishing high school, drifting between friends' couches and temporary spaces. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic send-off, just a quiet exit from a town that never quite made room for him. Aberdeen did not produce rock stars, it produced workers. But in the margins of that town, in garages and bedrooms, a sound was forming. Not polished, not yet famous, just raw. The house overlooking Seattle would one day define an ending, but Aberdeen defined the fracture long before fame entered the frame. By the late 1980s, the garages and small venues of the Pacific Northwest had become a breeding ground for distortion and discontent. Out of that scene emerged a band that didn't look built for stardom, but would redefine it. Kurt Cobain, alongside bassist Chris Novoselic and later drummer Dave Grohl, formed Nirvana. Their early recordings under Sub Pop carried the grit of regional underground music, heavy guitars, unpolished vocals, melodies buried under feedback. It wasn't calculated rebellion. It was texture, thick, abrasive, honest. In 1991, everything changed. Nevermind was released with modest expectations. Then, Smells Like Teen Spirit exploded. The opening riff cut through radio programming that had been saturated with glam rock and polished pop. Within months, Nirvana wasn't just another alternative band, they were a cultural earthquake. MTV rotated the music video relentlessly. Teenagers across America, and beyond, adopted flannel shirts and thrift store aesthetics, not as fashion statements, but as identifiers. Grunge wasn't just sound, it was posture, anti-gloss, anti-excess. Kurt's voice, strained, cracked, raw, became the sonic fingerprint of a generation that felt unseen. The irony was immediate. The band that rejected corporate sheen was suddenly dominating mainstream charts. Nevermind knocked established pop icons from the #1 spot. Magazine covers followed, interviews multiplied. Kurt appeared on television stages that once would have seemed distant from the damp garages of Washington state. Yet even as the crowds grew larger, something in his expression remained guarded. On stage, he hurled himself into songs with urgency, sometimes smashing guitars not as spectacle, but as punctuation. The performances were electric, not choreographed perfection, but volatile intensity. Success did not feel triumphant in a conventional sense. It felt complicated. Kurt had written songs rooted in discomfort and alienation. Now those songs were sung back to him by thousands of voices in unison. The underground had become arena-sized. The tension between authenticity and amplification began to surface in interviews. He resisted being labeled spokesman of anything, yet journalists insisted on framing him as the reluctant prophet of youth dissatisfaction. By 1992, Nirvana was no longer just a band, they were a benchmark. Alternative music surged into mainstream pipelines. Record labels scrambled to sign grunge acts. The 1990s had found their soundtrack, and Kurt Cobain was at its center, whether he wanted to be or not. Fame had arrived at full volume. And once volume reaches that level, there is no quiet switch to flip. By 1992, Kurt Cobain had become the face of something he never asked to represent. The media crowned him the voice of a generation, a title that sounded powerful but felt suffocating. Journalists searched his lyrics for manifestos. Talk show hosts framed him as a cultural philosopher. Record executives saw numbers. Kurt saw distortion. Not the musical kind, but the kind that bends identity. He had written songs about alienation, and now alienation had multiplied under flashbulbs. Fame did not arrive quietly, it came with scrutiny. Tabloids dissected his relationship with Courtney Love. Headlines speculated about drug use, about parenting, about instability. The birth of their daughter, Frances Bean Cobain, became public debate. Social services investigations made private matters headline material. Kurt oscillated between defensive and dismissive in interviews, sometimes mocking the press, sometimes withdrawing entirely. The more cameras pointed, the more he recoiled. Behind the scenes, heroin addiction tightened its grip. Kurt had long struggled with chronic stomach pain, something he claimed had plagued him for years. Drugs blurred that pain, physical and emotional. Rehab attempts punctuated the touring schedule. Each return to the stage felt both triumphant and fragile. The irony deepened. Audiences screamed for authenticity while ignoring the deterioration behind it. Addiction was not part of the mythology fans wanted to preserve. It was a reality they preferred to edit out. Creatively, Kurt remained restless. In Utero, 1993, was deliberately harsher, more abrasive than Nevermind. It was a statement against overproduction, against dilution. Some saw it as defiance, others saw it as self-sabotage. Kurt insisted it was honesty. The band resisted radio-friendly edits, pushing back against expectations that had grown exponentially since 1991. But resistance did not dissolve pressure, it amplified tension. In interviews during this period, Kurt's demeanor shifted, sometimes playful, sometimes visibly exhausted. He bristled at the idea of permanence. He questioned the machinery of celebrity culture openly. There were moments when he seemed aware of being consumed by the very system he criticized. Fame had given him reach. It had also taken privacy, anonymity, and perhaps a sense of scale. When millions project meaning onto you, personal confusion becomes public theater. The war with fame was not explosive. It was cumulative. Every headline, every rumor, every expectation layered onto an already fragile psyche. By early 1994, Kurt Cobain was no longer simply a musician navigating success. He was a man trying to outrun the echo of his own amplification, and discovering that volume, once unleashed, does not easily fade. In March 1994, the public narrative around Kurt Cobain shifted from controversy to concern. After an incident in Rome that was initially described as an accident but widely interpreted as a possible overdose, Kurt returned to the United States under increasing pressure from family and management. An intervention followed. Friends, bandmates, and loved ones urged him to seek treatment. Reluctantly, he entered a rehabilitation facility in Los Angeles. For a brief moment, it appeared as though the spiral might pause, but within days, he left. Slipping over a fence, boarding a flight back to Seattle, Kurt re-entered the city without clear plans. It was not theatrical. There was no announcement, just absence. Calls went unanswered. Appearances were missed. Concern grew quietly before it became official. A missing persons report was filed after Courtney Love hired a private investigator to track his whereabouts. The narrative shifted again, from troubled icon to vanished figure. In Seattle, rumors spread faster than facts. Friends claimed to have seen him. Others insisted he was hiding intentionally. Police involvement remained procedural, cautious. There was no dramatic manhunt, no flashing searchlights. Instead, there was uncertainty, a void where communication should have been. Kurt's withdrawal felt both deliberate and fragile. Those close to him later described confusion, frustration, and fear. Yet the public only saw fragments filtered through media updates. When his body was discovered on April 8, investigators determined he had died several days earlier. The official ruling was suicide by shotgun wound. A note was found at the scene, interpreted as both farewell and expression of exhaustion. Toxicology reports confirmed high levels of heroin in his system. For authorities, the case closed swiftly. For fans, it did not. Questions emerged almost immediately. About timing, about handwriting, about motive. Conspiracy theories began circulating, refusing to dissolve even decades later. But beyond speculation lies something quieter, the image of disappearance itself. A man who once stood at the center of amplified noise had slipped into silence without spectacle. There was no final concert, no orchestrated goodbye, just a series of small, fractured days that ended in stillness. And in that stillness, a generation was left to assemble meaning from fragments. In the years after 1994, Kurt Cobain stopped being just a musician and became an emblem. Not the polished kind carved by marketing teams, but the kind shaped by unfinished sentences and unresolved tension. He entered the mythology of the 27 Club, grouped alongside artists whose brilliance burned fast and ended early. But Kurt's legacy is not just about age or tragedy, it is about contradiction. He despised celebrity culture, yet his image became one of the most reproduced visuals of the 1990s. The oversized cardigan from the 1993 MTV Unplugged performance became symbolic of vulnerability wrapped in distortion. His fragmented lyrics, once raw expressions of confusion, turned into generational scripture quoted on posters, tattoos, and documentaries. Bands across the 2000s cited Nirvana as blueprint, not only for sound but for stance, stripped down honesty over spectacle. What endures is not only the music but the tension he embodied. He represented discomfort in an era craving authenticity. He resisted being labeled, yet labels attached themselves anyway: grunge king, spokesman, martyr. Perhaps the reason the mythology persists is because it remains unsettled. The questions never fully quieted. Neither did the influence. Kurt Cobain did not ask to carry a crown. He questioned systems, doubted institutions, and distrusted adoration. Yet history rarely consults intention. The voice that once rasped through distortion now echoes through decades, not as perfection, not as resolution, but as reminder that vulnerability, amplified, can outlive the body that carried it.